The biting wind seemed to claw at Ilara's face, each gust a personal affront, a sneering welcome to the jagged, snow-choked wilderness that was to be her new life. The train, a monstrous, belching serpent of iron and steam, had deposited her onto a rickety platform hours ago, a place that felt less like a station and more like an afterthought in the vast, indifferent landscape. From there, a bone-jarring wagon ride, driven by a taciturn man who offered no comfort beyond a moth-eaten blanket, had brought her to this desolate rendezvous point, a windswept crossroads where two barely discernible tracks intersected beneath a sky the color of lead. Her hands, tucked deep into the threadbare pockets of her coat, were numb, but not as numb as the fear that had settled like a stone in her stomach. This was it. The end of one desperate road, the beginning of another, hopefully less so. Elias Thorne. The name, once a beacon of tentative hope scrawled on thin, hopeful letters, now felt like a brand, marking her as his. His correspondence had been sparse but kind, his proposal of marriage practical, offering escape from the suffocating poverty and shame that had dogged her since her father's ruin and subsequent death. He'd written of a quiet life, a sturdy cabin, the dignity of honest work in a land where a woman's past mattered less than her willingness to build a future. Ilara, clinging to that promise, had packed her meager belongings and her even more meager hopes, and crossed half a continent. A figure emerged from the dense, snow-laden pines, moving with a halting, uneven gait that immediately set her on edge. This was not the strong, capable man his letters had subtly implied. As he drew closer, her heart sank further. He was tall, yes, and broad-shouldered, but his face, shadowed by a heavy fur cap, was grim, etched with pain. One arm was bound tightly to his chest in a makeshift sling, and he leaned heavily on a sturdy branch that served as a crude crutch. His eyes, when they finally met hers, were a startling, icy blue, but they held no warmth, only a flicker of something that might have been irritation, or perhaps just exhaustion. "You're Ilara," he stated, his voice a low rumble, rough as an unoiled hinge. It wasn't a question. She nodded, unable to find her own voice, the frigid air seeming to steal the words from her lips. "Silas." "Silas Thorne," he corrected, his gaze sweeping over her, dismissive, appraising her as one might a pack animal. "Not Elias." "Silas." A tremor of unease, sharp and cold, ran down her spine. Had she misremembered the name? Or had he? But the letters, they had been signed Elias. She was sure of it. Before she could voice the confusion, he gestured impatiently with his good hand towards a narrow, almost invisible path leading deeper into the woods. "Cabin's a ways yet. We need to move before the light fades completely." His tone brooked no argument, offered no apology for his condition or the discrepancy in his name. Perhaps Elias was a brother, and this Silas was fetching her? But his words, "my cabin," had been implied in his letters. He carried no pack, save for a rifle slung awkwardly over his good shoulder. Her own small trunk and valise sat forlornly by the rough-hewn signpost marking the supposed settlement of Bear Creek, though there was no creek visible, nor any sign of settlement beyond the oppressive silence of the forest. "My things," she ventured, her voice small, thin. Silas grunted, a sound of pure displeasure. "Can't carry them." Not like this. He gestured to his injured arm. "Bear. 3 days ago. Lucky to be alive or a bear." The word conjured images of savage power, of teeth and claws. It explained his injury, his grimness. But it didn't explain the name, nor did it alleviate the growing dread that tightened her chest. "Leave them. Maybe I can fetch them later." Or not later. In this wilderness, later felt like a euphemism for never. Everything she owned, everything that connected her to her past, meager as it was in that trunk. But the look in his eyes, the set of his jaw, told her arguing would be futile, possibly dangerous. He was a man pushed to his limits, by pain, by circumstance. And she, it seemed, was just another burden. Swallowing her dismay, Ilara nodded again, a tight, jerky movement. She pulled her thin shawl closer around her shoulders, the wind finding every gap in her warm clothing. The hope that had sustained her through the long journey felt like a dying ember, about to be snuffed out by the encroaching cold and the grim reality of her situation. This was not the sanctuary she had envisioned. This was something far harsher, far more uncertain. And the man leading her into it, this Silas Thorne, was a stranger, wounded and unwelcoming. "What have I done?" The question echoed in the silent chambers of her heart, a frantic, desperate cry against the encroaching wilderness and the deepening twilight. He turned without another word and began to move slowly, painfully, down the snow-filled track. Elara hesitated for only a moment, casting a last, sorrowful glance at her abandoned luggage, then, with a deep, fortifying breath that tasted of pine and fear, she followed him into the darkening woods. The trees closed in around them, their snow-laden branches like skeletal arms, reaching, grasping. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of their boots in the snow and Silas's occasional pained grunt. Each step took her further from everything she knew, deeper into an unknown that felt increasingly menacing. Her initial desperation had been for escape from a life of shame. Now, a new, more primal desperation began to take root, the simple, urgent need to survive whatever lay ahead. The trek to the cabin was an ordeal that stretched Elara's endurance to its breaking point, a grim baptism into the unforgiving nature of her new world. Silas, despite his injury, set a relentless pace, driven by a desperate urgency that seemed to ignore both his own pain and her struggles. The snow, which had been a picturesque dusting in the more civilized land she'd left behind, was here a deep, clinging impediment, sometimes reaching her knees, each step an exhausting effort. Her thin-soled city boots, wholly inadequate for such terrain, were soon soaked through, her feet aching with a cold that seeped into her very bones. She stumbled frequently, her ankles twisting on hidden roots and uneven ground, but Silas offered no assistance, no word of encouragement. He would merely pause, his breathing harsh and ragged, his good hand pressed against his bound arm, his icy gaze fixing her with an impatience that made her flush with a mixture of shame and resentment. "Keep up," he'd rasp, his voice raw. "Night's coming. And wolves. Another terror to add to the growing list. She had read of them, of course, in books depicting wild, untamed lands, but the reality of their presence, here, now, was a cold knot of fear in her stomach. She imagined their eyes gleaming in the darkness, their howls echoing through the silent, snow-draped forest. The thought spurred her onward, fatigue momentarily forgotten in a fresh surge of adrenaline. The landscape was relentlessly hostile, a monochrome world of white and gray and the dark, skeletal silhouettes of pine and fir. The towering trees pressed in on them, their branches so thickly interlaced that only slivers of the dying afternoon light penetrated the gloom, creating an eerie, perpetual twilight. Elara found herself constantly scanning the oppressive woods, her senses straining for any sign of movement, any sound beyond their own labored progress. The silence itself was unnerving, a vast, empty canvas upon which her anxieties painted vivid and terrifying pictures. She tried to engage Silas in conversation, to glean some small piece of information about their destination, about him, about the man named Elias she had believed she was marrying. "How much further is it?" she asked, her breath pluming in the frigid air. He grunted, a non-committal sound. "When we get there later," she tried again. "This bear, did it come near the cabin?" He shot her a sharp, suspicious look. "What's it to you?" His defensiveness was a wall, deflecting even the simplest inquiry. The discrepancy in the name gnawed at her. "The letters, they said Elias Thorne." He stopped then, turning so abruptly she almost collided with him. His face, pale and sweat-sheen despite the cold, was tight with a mixture of pain and something else, something darker. "Elias is my brother." "Was. He's dead. Died last spring. Flu's dead." The word hit her with the force of a physical blow. Dead. Then who had written those letters? Who had sent the money for her passage? Her mind reeled, struggling to process the information. Silas watched her, his expression unreadable. He made arrangements for a wife before his voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "Figured I'd honor Lem. Cabin needs a woman. Not, I need a wife. Not, I desire companionship." A purely practical assessment. She was a commodity, a pair of hands to fill a void. The small, flickering flame of hope she had so carefully nurtured, the hope for a partner, for a shared life, died completely, leaving behind only the cold ashes of disillusionment. This man, Silas, was not the gentle, if somewhat laconic, correspondent she had imagined. He was a stranger bound to her by a dead man's promise, a promise he seemed to be fulfilling with grim reluctance. Her internal turmoil was a silent storm, raging against the backdrop of her physical misery. Betrayal, confusion, fear, they churned within her, threatening to overwhelm her. But some deep-seated instinct for self-preservation, honed by years of quiet hardship, kept her moving, kept her from collapsing into the snow and surrendering to despair. She had come this far. She had to see it through, whatever it was. The last hour of the journey was undertaken in near total darkness, the moon obscured by thick, low-hanging clouds that promised more snow. Silas, despite his injury, seemed to navigate the invisible path with an uncanny certainty, while Elara stumbled blindly, her hands outstretched, often brushing against the rough bark of trees or unseen, snow-laden bushes. Twice, she fell heavily, the impact jarring through her exhausted body. The second time, a sob escaped her, a raw sound of utter desolation. Silas paused, looking back, a dark shape against the slightly less dark sky. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something akin to concern in his posture, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Almost there," he said, his voice a little less harsh, perhaps tinged with his own weariness. And then, finally, through a thinning in the trees, she saw it, a faint, pale square of light. A window. The cabin. It was small, a dark, hunched shape against the snow, smoke curling thinly from a stone chimney, a fragile plume against the vast, indifferent sky. It looked less like a home and more like a last, desperate outpost against the encroaching wilderness. As they drew nearer, she could make out its rough-hewn log walls, the steeply pitched roof laden with snow. There were no other lights, no other signs of human habitation for what felt like 1,000 miles. This was it. Her new home. Her prison. A wave of profound weariness washed over her, so potent it nearly buckled her knees. Silas fumbled with a latch, then pushed the heavy plank door inward, revealing a dimly lit, cramped interior. The air that greeted her was thick with the smell of wood smoke, stale food, and something else, something faintly medicinal and unpleasant. Silas lurched inside, his crutch thudding heavily on the wooden floor. He gestured vaguely. Elara hesitated on the threshold, a cold dread coiling in her stomach. The faint light from within seemed to promise little warmth, little comfort. But the biting wind at her back, and the oppressive darkness of the forest surrounding her, left her no choice. Taking a shallow, unsteady breath, she stepped across the threshold, into the unknown. The cabin was even smaller and more primitive inside than its rough exterior had suggested. A single room, low-ceilinged and shadowy, served as kitchen, living space, and, judging by the crude bunk built against one wall, bedroom. A stone fireplace dominated one end, a meager fire sputtering within its blackened maw, casting flickering, dancing shadows that made the cramped space feel even more claustrophobic. The air was heavy, thick with the smells Elara had noticed at the door, wood smoke, old grease, the lingering scent of whatever herb Silas had used on his wound, and an underlying mustiness that spoke of damp and disuse. A rough-hewn table and 2 mismatched stools stood near the center of the room. A few iron pots and pans hung from pegs on the wall near a dry sink, its surface stained and scarred. Shelves holding a meager assortment of tins and jars lined another wall. There were no curtains on the single small window, just a grimy pane of glass offering a bleak view of the unrelenting snow outside. It was a place built for survival, not comfort, a testament to a harsh, solitary existence. Silas slumped onto one of the stools, his face pale and beaded with sweat in the dim firelight. He gestured towards the bunk with his good hand. "Bed's there. You can take it for now. I'll manage by the fire." His tone was flat, exhausted. It was a concession, perhaps, but it felt less like generosity and more like a practical decision made by a man too injured to care about propriety. Elara stood uncertainly, her soaked shawl clutched around her, her gaze taking in the grim details. This was a far cry from the sturdy, comfortable cabin Elias's letters had described. Had Elias even seen this place? Or had his descriptions been born of hope of a future he would never live to see? The thought brought a fresh pang of sorrow, not just for her own dashed expectations, but for the unknown man whose death had so drastically altered her destiny. Is there water?" she asked, her throat dry, her voice barely a whisper. Silas nodded towards a bucket in the corner. "Snowmelt." "Help yourself." He watched her as she moved stiffly towards it, ladling a small amount into a tin cup with trembling hands. The water was icy cold, but it soothed her parched throat. Her resourcefulness, that quiet, persistent part of her that had navigated countless small crises in her past, began to stir. This was her reality now. She could succumb to despair, or she could try to make the best of it, however bleak that best might be. First, she needed to get out of her wet clothes. But where? There was no privacy here, no screen, no separate room. Silas seemed to read her thoughts. "Don't mind me," he grunted, turning his gaze pointedly towards the fire. Seen worse, his crudeness stung, but she was too cold, too tired to protest. She turned her back to him, fumbling with the buttons of her sodden dress, her fingers clumsy with cold. She changed into the dry, if worn, dress she carried in her small satchel, the only luggage she'd managed to bring with her. The simple act of being in dry clothes brought a small measure of relief. She looked at Silas. He was slumped over the table, his head resting on his good arm, his breathing shallow. His injury, the arduous journey, had clearly taken a toll. He needed care, whether he wanted it or not. And she, it seemed, was the only one to provide it. "Your arm," she said softly. "Should I look at it?" "Change the dressing." He didn't answer for a moment, and she wondered if he'd fallen asleep. Then, he shifted, lifting his head. His eyes were clouded with pain. "Leave it might fester," she pressed gently. "I know a little about wounds." Her mother had been skilled with herbs and remedies, and Elara had learned much at her side. He hesitated, then gave a curt, reluctant nod. "Bandages are in that tin." He gestured towards a small, dented box on one of the shelves. She found clean strips of linen and a jar of pungent salve. Carefully, she approached him. "Let me help you with your coat." He allowed her to ease the heavy garment off his shoulders, hissing in pain as his injured arm was jostled. The wound, when she unwrapped the blood-stained dressing, was angry and inflamed, the flesh around the deep gashes swollen and purplish. A bear, indeed. It was a miracle he hadn't bled to death or lost the arm entirely. She cleaned it as best she could with snowmelt and a bit of soap she found, then applied the salve and fresh bandages. Her touch was gentle, efficient. Silas remained silent throughout, watching her with an intensity that made her uneasy. His breath was hot on her hands when she worked close to his face. As she worked, her gaze drifted around the cabin again, noticing small details that pricked at her unease. The place felt unlived in, yet simultaneously neglected. There were no personal touches, no books, no mementos, nothing to suggest the presence of the man, Elias, who had supposedly built it and lived here. There was a second, smaller, much cruder bunk tucked into a dark corner, almost hidden by shadows, piled with dirty blankets. Had Elias slept there? Or someone else? And why had Silas, if he was Elias's brother and had inherited the cabin, not made it more his own? There was a peculiar sparseness, a lack of history to the place that felt wrong. The shelves held only the barest necessities, a few tins of beans, some flour, coffee, salt. It was the larder of a transient, not someone settled. A chill, unrelated to the cabin's temperature, crept over her. Something wasn't right. It was more than just the shock of Silas's injury, or the death of the man she thought she was marrying. It was the cabin itself, the atmosphere, the subtle inconsistencies that whispered of secrets untold. She finished tending to his arm, her mind racing. "You should rest," she said, keeping her voice carefully neutral. He nodded, his eyes heavy-lidded. She helped him to the main bunk, the one he had offered her. He sank onto it with a groan, clearly exhausted. Elara busied herself by the fire, adding a few small pieces of wood, trying to coax more warmth into the cheerless room. She was alone, truly alone, with a wounded, taciturn stranger in a desolate cabin miles from anywhere, in the dead of winter. And a growing, terrifying suspicion that she had walked into something far more dangerous than she could ever have imagined. The silence of the cabin pressed in, broken only by Silas's raspy breathing and the crackle of the fire. She wrapped her shawl tighter, not against the cold, but against the fear. Days bled into a monotonous cycle of tending the fire, melting snow for water, preparing meager meals from their dwindling supplies, and caring for Silas. His fever, which had flared the first night, eventually broke, but his recovery was slow, his pain a constant, brooding presence in the small cabin. He remained largely uncommunicative, his responses to her attempts at conversation clipped and grudging. He watched her, though. She felt his eyes on her as she moved about the cramped space, a silent, unnerving scrutiny that kept her perpetually on edge. Elara, driven by a need to impose some semblance of order on the oppressive chaos, did her best to make the cabin habitable. She swept the rough wooden floor, wiped down the grimy surfaces, and even attempted to air out the stale, musty smell, though the biting cold outside made this a brief and largely futile endeavor. She found a tattered quilt in a dusty wooden chest and mended it, her fingers moving with a practiced skill that was a legacy of her genteel but impoverished upbringing. These small acts of domesticity were a way of clinging to her sanity, of creating a small island of normalcy in a sea of uncertainty and fear. But beneath the surface of these mundane tasks, her unease festered and grew. The cabin continued to feel wrong, its secrets pressing in on her from the shadowy corners. She noticed things. A section of the floorboards beneath the secondary, cruder bunk looked newer than the rest, the wood lighter, the fit less perfect. There were no tools visible in the cabin, beyond a hunting knife and an axe propped near the door, strange for a place supposedly built and maintained by a man, or men, living in the wilderness. Where were the saws, the hammers, the augers? And the letters from Elias? Silas had dismissed them as his dead brother's arrangements, but the handwriting, she recalled, had been strong, assertive. It hadn't felt like the script of a man succumbing to illness. One afternoon, while Silas slept heavily, a rare occurrence, Elara felt an overwhelming compulsion to search. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and a strange, almost illicit excitement. She knew it was risky. If he woke, his reaction would be unpredictable, possibly violent. But the not knowing, the constant, gnawing suspicion, was becoming unbearable. She moved with a stealth she hadn't known she possessed, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. Her gaze fell upon the loose floorboard she had noticed earlier, beneath the shadowed bunk in the corner. It was piled with Silas's discarded, soiled bandages and a few ragged furs, as if to deliberately obscure it. Holding her breath, she carefully moved the items aside. The boards were indeed newer, and one of them, she now saw, had a small, almost invisible notch along its edge, as if designed to be lifted. Her fingers trembled as she inserted the tip of her mending needle into the notch and gently pried. The board lifted with a faint groan of wood against wood. Beneath it was not the packed earth she expected, but a dark, hollow space. A small, concealed compartment. Her breath caught in her throat. What could be hidden here? And why? Reaching into the darkness, her fingers brushed against something wrapped in oilskin. It was heavy, rectangular. With a surge of adrenaline, she pulled it out. Sitting on the edge of the main bunk, her back to the sleeping Silas, she unwrapped the package. Inside was a book. A journal. Its cover was plain, dark leather, worn smooth at the edges. A thin leather thong held it closed. Her hand shook so violently she could barely untie it. This felt significant, deeply so. A hidden journal. Whose story did it hold? And why was it concealed with such care? She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat, feminine, written in faded ink. October 12th arrived at Bear Creek. The journey was long, but my heart is full of hope. Elias Thorne awaits. He seems a good man, if quiet. The cabin is small, but he promises we will make it a home. Elias Thorne. The name leapt out at her. This was not his journal. It belonged to another woman. A woman who had come here, just as Elara had, full of hope, to marry Elias Thorne. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She looked at Silas, his face slack in sleep, his breathing even. He had said Elias died last spring. This entry was dated October. Last October? Or an October years before? She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the entries. They began with optimism, descriptions of the landscape, plans for a garden, tentative hopes for a future. Then, gradually, the tone began to change. November 5th. Elias is different. More withdrawn. His moods are dark. He watches me. Sometimes, I feel like a fly caught in a spider's web. December 1st. The snows have come. We are truly isolated now. I have not seen another soul for weeks. Elias, he frightens me sometimes. His anger is like a sudden storm. Elara's blood ran cold. This was not the story of a happy union. This was a chronicle of growing fear, of isolation, of a man changing, or perhaps, revealing his true nature. She felt a horrifying sense of recognition. The isolation, the watching eyes, the unpredictable moods, she was living it, with Silas. But this journal spoke of Elias. Had Silas lied about his brother's death? Or was this an older story, and Silas was merely repeating a pattern? The entries grew more sporadic, more desperate. January 10th. He locked me in today when he went hunting. Said it was for my own safety. I don't believe him. The silence in this cabin when he is gone is a living thing. It breathes fear. February 3rd. I found his tools hidden in the woodshed. Saws, an axe with a new handle. He told me he had none. Why would he lie about such a thing? Then, a scrawled, almost illegible entry, dated late February. He knows I am afraid. I think he likes it. I tried to speak of leaving, of going back. His eyes. I have never seen such coldness. He said this is my home now. Forever. I must find a way. I must. The journal ended there. Mid-sentence. Nothing more. Elara stared at the last, desperate words, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Forever. What had happened to this woman? This Lydia, for that was the name signed at the bottom of a few earlier, more hopeful entries. Lydia. Where was she now? The implications were terrifying. Elias Thorne, the man Lydia described, sounded nothing like the kind correspondent Elara had exchanged letters with, and bore a chilling resemblance to the brooding, watchful Silas. Or were Elias and Silas one and the same? Had Silas assumed his dead brother's identity to lure women here? Or worse, had Elias been the monster, and Silas was, what? His accomplice? His successor? The question swirled in her mind, a horrifying vortex of possibilities, each more dreadful than the last. She looked again at the sleeping Silas, his face in repose almost boyish, yet lines of cruelty were etched around his mouth, lines she hadn't fully acknowledged before. He was capable of deception. He was capable of, what else? The journal was a testament, a warning. Lydia had come here full of hope, and her hope had turned to terror. And then, she had vanished. Elara clutched the journal to her chest, a cold, hard knot of dread tightening within her. She was not the first. And if she wasn't careful, she might suffer the same fate. The shocking find wasn't just a journal, it was a voice from the grave, a chilling echo of her own predicament, and a terrifying portent of what might be to come. The discovery of Lydia's journal shattered Elara's remaining illusions, replacing them with a cold, visceral fear. She was trapped, not just by the winter and the wilderness, but by a man whose true nature was becoming terrifyingly apparent. The words in that slim, leather-bound book were a mirror, reflecting her own isolation, her own dawning apprehension, but showing a path that led to a horrifying, silent end. Lydia's story became Elara's obsession. She reread the entries whenever Silas slept or was otherwise occupied, her heart aching for the woman whose hopes had withered into terror within these same four walls. Each detail Lydia recorded, the changing moods of Elias, his possessiveness, his subtle cruelties, resonated with Elara's own experiences with Silas. Were they two separate men, brothers twisted by the same darkness, or was Silas a chameleon, capable of assuming his brother's identity, perhaps even his crimes. The journal mentioned Elias's tools hidden in a woodshed. There was a dilapidated lean-to attached to the back of the cabin, half collapsed under snow, which Silas never went near. Could that be it? The thought of investigating it, of finding more proof, was both terrifying and compelling. For days, Ilara lived a dual existence. Outwardly, she maintained her routine, tending to Silas, cooking their meager meals, keeping the fire alive. She forced herself to speak to him, to ask about his arm, to feign a normalcy that felt like a betrayal of Lydia, and a dangerous charade for herself. Inside, however, she was a whirlwind of fear and frantic calculation. She studied Silas, his habits, his movements, the way his eyes, no longer clouded by the worst of his fever, seemed to miss nothing. His strength was returning, slowly but perceptibly. He moved with less pain, his reliance on the crutch diminishing. With his returning health, the subtle balance of power in the cabin, already skewed, shifted further against her. He was becoming less the patient, more the captor. Her every move felt scrutinized. When she lingered too long by the window, gazing out at the endless snow, he would ask sharply, "What are you looking at?" If she fell silent for too long, engrossed in her own dark thoughts, he would demand, "What's wrong with you?" His suspicion was a palpable thing, coiling in the tense air between them. She kept Lydia's journal hidden, returning it to its oilskin wrapping and the secret compartment beneath the bunk whenever she wasn't reading it. The fear of him finding it was constant. It was her only link to the truth, her only warning. One evening, as a fresh blizzard raged outside, rattling the ill-fitting windowpane and sending drafts of icy air snaking across the floor, Silas was more restless than usual. He paced the small confines of the cabin, his recovering arm still held stiffly, but his movements were regaining their predatory grace. Ilara sat at the table, mending one of his torn shirts by the flickering firelight, her needle moving mechanically while her mind raced. "You're quiet tonight," he said, his voice startlingly close. He had stopped directly behind her. She could feel his presence, a looming shadow. She forced a calm she didn't feel. "Just listening to the storm." "It's fierce, this land is fierce," he replied, his tone carrying a strange satisfaction. "It breaks an _y_ thing weak. Was that a threat? A warning?" She didn't dare look up. "You seem stronger," she offered, trying to deflect. "Your arm is healing well," he grunted. "It'll do." He moved away, resuming his pacing. Later, as she was preparing to retire to the main bunk, he had insisted on taking the smaller, darker one himself now, a move that felt more about surveillance than comfort. He spoke again, his voice low. "Elias, he wasn't strong enough for this place. For what it demands." Ilara's heart leaped. It was the first time he had mentioned his brother in days, and the comment felt loaded, significant. "The flu, it takes even the strong," she murmured, testing the waters. Silas snorted, a harsh, dismissive sound. Wasn't just the flu. He was soft. Had foolish ideas like marrying for companionship? Like treating a woman with kindness? Like Lydia's hope for a garden? Ilara felt a surge of anger, quickly suppressed. She had to be careful. So very careful. That night, sleep eluded her. The wind howled like a banshee, and with each gust, Lydia's desperate words seemed to echo in the darkness. "He knows I am afraid. I think he likes it." The cabin felt like a tomb, and she, its next inhabitant. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the core, that she couldn't stay. She had to escape. But how? The wilderness was a formidable enemy, the winter relentless. And Silas? Silas was becoming more dangerous by the day. The journal was her only ally, Lydia's ghost her silent confidant. She had to find out what happened to Lydia, not just for Lydia's sake, but for her own. Because if she didn't, she was certain Lydia's fate would be hers. The next morning, the blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world transformed, buried under a fresh, deep blanket of snow. The beauty of it was lost on Ilara. All she saw was another obstacle, another layer to her prison. But with the clear, cold light came a sliver of resolve. She had to find that woodshed. She had to know. The weight of Lydia's journal pressed upon Ilara constantly, a tangible burden of secrets and fear. She knew she couldn't remain passive, a lamb awaiting slaughter. The fierce, primal instinct to survive, an instinct she hadn't known she possessed in such measure, was now fully awake, battling the terror that threatened to paralyze her. She began to plan, not a detailed, foolproof strategy, for that seemed impossible in her current predicament, but small, cautious steps towards understanding her situation and, hopefully, towards freedom. Her primary objective became investigating the dilapidated lean-to that Silas ignored, the place she suspected was the woodshed Lydia had mentioned. It was attached to the rear of the cabin, a part of the structure she rarely saw, as the main door and window faced the front. Silas usually relieved himself some distance from the cabin in the woods, and her own ventures outside were typically brief, confined to fetching snow for water from just beyond the doorstep. Reaching the woodshed undetected would be a challenge. Silas's eyes seemed to follow her everywhere, his senses sharp despite, or perhaps because of, his isolation. She began to observe his routines more closely. He spent long hours staring into the fire, or fitfully sleeping, but his periods of wakefulness were unpredictable. His injury, while healing, still caused him discomfort, and he would often rise in the night to pace or add wood to the stove. Her opportunity, she realized, would have to come when he was deeply asleep, or if he left the cabin to hunt, though he hadn't shown any inclination to do so since her arrival, likely due to his arm. The thought of him hunting, leaving her alone, was both terrifying and filled with a desperate hope. She started to subtly test his reactions. One morning, feigning a need for more firewood than the small stack inside provided, she ventured a little further from the door than usual, her gaze drifting towards the back of the cabin. "Wood's closer this way," Silas called out sharply from the doorway, his voice laced with suspicion. Her heart pounded, but she kept her expression mild. "Oh, I thought I saw some drier pieces further over." She quickly gathered a few logs from the nearer pile and retreated inside, chiding herself for her clumsiness. She had to be more careful, less obvious. She also began to pay more attention to their dwindling supplies. The flour was low, the salted meat nearly gone. Soon, he would have to venture out, either to hunt or to retrieve supplies from some hidden cache or distant trading post, if such a thing even existed in this desolate wilderness. This thought filled her with a mixture of dread and anticipation. His absence would be her chance, but what if he took her with him? Or worse, what if he didn't return, leaving her to starve? The cabin itself became a map of potential resources and dangers. She noted the axe by the door, his hunting knife always on his belt or beside his bunk. Were there other weapons? Lydia's journal had mentioned his tools. If they were in the woodshed, could any of them be used to defend herself, or to aid an escape? She thought of the heavy iron poker by the fireplace, the cast iron skillet. Small comforts against a man like Silas, but not entirely useless. Her greatest fear was his finding the journal. She took to carrying it on her person, tucked into the waistband of her skirt, covered by her shawl, despite the discomfort. The secret compartment felt too risky now that he was more mobile and his suspicions were aroused. One afternoon, Silas announced he was going to check some snares he claimed to have set before the bear attack. "Don't wander," he warned, his eyes cold and hard. "Stay inside. Keep the fire going." Ilara's heart leaped. This was it. Her first real chance. She nodded, trying to appear submissive, unremarkable. "I will." He took his rifle and the axe, his movements still somewhat stiff but undeniably more capable. The door closed behind him, the heavy thud echoing in the sudden, profound silence of the cabin. For a moment, Ilara simply stood, her breath catching in her throat. Freedom. Temporary, terrifying, but freedom nonetheless. Then, galvanized by a surge of adrenaline, she moved. She raced to the small, grimy window, peering out to watch him disappear into the dense trees, his figure a dark silhouette against the blinding white snow. Only when he was completely out of sight did she dare to act. Her first instinct was the woodshed. She bundled herself in her shawl, her hands trembling, and slipped out the main door, then crept around the side of the cabin, her boots sinking deep into the fresh snow, making her progress slow and arduous. The lean-to was even more dilapidated up close than it had appeared from a distance. Its roof sagged precariously, and several wall planks were missing, revealing a dark, cluttered interior. The door, a flimsy construction of mismatched boards, was held shut by a simple wooden toggle. With a surge of desperate strength, she wrestled with the frozen toggle, her fingers numb despite her gloves. Finally, it gave way, and she pulled the creaking door open. The air inside was frigid, smelling of damp earth, decaying wood, and something else, something metallic, like old rust. It was dark, the only light filtering through the gaps in the walls and roof. As her eyes adjusted, she could make out shapes, discarded equipment, piles of rotting canvas, and there, in the far corner, almost buried under a heap of debris, a wooden chest. And beside it, a collection of tools, just as Lydia had written. A handsaw, a heavy mallet, an auger, and another axe, its head dark with what looked like old, dried blood. Ilara's breath hitched. This was it. Proof. But there was no time to examine them closely. Her attention was drawn to the chest. It was old, bound with rusted iron bands, and secured with a heavy padlock. What secrets did it hold? Lydia's belongings? More journals? Or something far more sinister? She tugged at the padlock, but it was solid, unyielding. Frustration and fear warred within her. She had to know what was inside. She looked around wildly. The blooded axe, no, too gruesome, too risky. Her gaze fell on a sturdy metal bar leaning against the wall, perhaps a pry bar. She seized it. It was heavy, cold in her hands. Positioning the tip against the hasp of the padlock, she began to lever it, putting all her weight and desperate strength into the effort. The wood around the hasp groaned, splintered. She pushed harder, sobbing with exertion and fear. With a sudden, sharp crack, the hasp broke free. Her hand shaking, she lifted the heavy lid of the chest. The contents were not what she expected. Not clothes, not journals. Instead, neatly stacked, were several more oilskin-wrapped packages of varying sizes, and, tucked in a corner, a small, worn child's doll, its painted eyes staring blankly upwards. A child's doll? Lydia's journal had never mentioned a child. A new, more profound wave of horror washed over Ilara. This was not just about Lydia. This was about something far larger, far more monstrous. Silas was not just a cruel husband, he was a predator, and this cabin, his lair. The sound of a snapping twig outside the woodshed sent a jolt of pure terror through her. Silas! He was back. The sound, sharp and sudden as a gunshot in the profound silence, froze Ilara in place. Silas! He couldn't be back already. He'd only just left. Her mind raced, a frantic torrent of denial and sheer panic. Had she misjudged the time? Had he forgotten something? Or had he never truly left, merely circled back, testing her? Her heart hammered against her ribs so violently she felt sick. The pry bar clattered from her nerveless fingers, landing with a muffled thud on the earthen floor of the woodshed. She was trapped. The woodshed had only one exit, the door she had just entered, and beyond it, undoubtedly, stood Silas. For a paralyzing moment, she could only stare at the open chest, at the oilskin packages and the haunting little doll, evidence of horrors she was only beginning to comprehend. Then, the instinct for self-preservation, raw and desperate, surged through her. She couldn't let him find her here. She couldn't let him know what she'd discovered. With fumbling, frantic haste, she slammed the lid of the chest shut. The broken hasp hung uselessly. It wouldn't fool him if he looked closely, but it was the best she could do. She kicked snow and debris over the pry bar, trying to obscure it. Her eyes darted around the cluttered shed, searching for a hiding place, but there was nowhere to go, nowhere to conceal herself from a man who knew this place intimately. Another sound, closer this time, the crunch of boots on snow, moving purposefully towards the woodshed. There was no more time. Her only chance, however slim, was to brazen it out, to feign a legitimate reason for being there. But what reason could there possibly be? Her mind was a blank wall of terror. She took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to quell the violent trembling in her limbs, and moved towards the woodshed door, forcing a semblance of composure she was far from feeling. She pulled the door open, squinting against the sudden brightness of the snow-reflected sunlight, her heart leaping into her throat. But it wasn't Silas who stood there. It was a deer. A young buck, its antlers still covered in velvet, stood not 10 feet away, its large, dark eyes fixed on her, its ears swiveling nervously. It had likely been startled by her movements inside the shed and had come to investigate. The relief that washed over Ilara was so intense it left her weak-kneed, leaning against the rough doorframe for support. She watched as the deer, after a moment's hesitation, turned and bounded gracefully away, disappearing into the trees. She was alone. Silas was not back. Not yet. But the encounter had been a stark warning. Her time was limited. Her nerves were frayed. Shaking, she stepped out of the woodshed, carefully relatching the broken door as best she could, trying to make it look undisturbed. The sight of the blooded axe head, glimpsed again in the better light, sent a fresh wave of nausea through her. She had to get back to the cabin, to erase any sign of her illicit exploration. She retraced her steps, her gaze sweeping the surrounding woods, every shadow, every rustle of wind in the branches, now a potential threat. Back inside the relative safety of the cabin, she stoked the fire, her hand still shaking. The image of the child's doll, its vacant stare, was burned into her mind. Whose child had it been? Had Lydia had a child? Or was there another victim, another story even more tragic than Lydia's? The oilskin packages in the chest, what did they contain? More journals? Clothing? Or something far more grisly? The possibilities were too horrifying to contemplate. She knew, with a sickening certainty, that Silas was not merely a cruel man, or even just a murderer of a previous wife. He was something else, something far more methodical and monstrous. The mail-order bride scheme, Elias's name, it was all a carefully constructed trap, a way to lure vulnerable women to this isolated place where they would simply disappear. And she was next. The brief reprieve from Silas's presence had given her a vital piece of the puzzle, but it had also amplified her terror 100-fold. She could no longer pretend, even to herself, that there might be a misunderstanding, a less sinister explanation for the strangeness of this place and the man who inhabited it. The woodshed, the chest, the doll, they were undeniable proof of a dark and deadly secret. She had to get Lydia's journal, her only tangible evidence, and the small store of supplies she had been trying to gather, and leave. Now. Before Silas returned. But where could she go? The wilderness was vast, the snow deep, the cold relentless. She had no map, no compass, only a vague sense of the direction from which they had come. Her chances of survival alone in the frozen forest were slim. But her chances of survival if she stayed with Silas were, she now knew, non-existent. He returned less than an hour later, empty-handed, his mood even fouler than when he had left. Nothing, he snarled, kicking snow from his boots at the door. Snares are empty. Animals are smarter than men in this damn place. He threw his rifle onto the bunk with a clatter and slumped at the table, radiating a menacing discontent. Ilara busied herself with preparing a meager meal of dried beans and the last of their flour, mixed into a thin gruel. Her hands trembled so much she could barely hold the spoon. She avoided his gaze, terrified that her fear, her knowledge, was written plainly on her face. "What's wrong with you?" he demanded suddenly, his eyes narrowing as he watched her. "You're shaking like a leaf. It's just the cold, I suppose," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "The fire's low," he grunted, unconvinced. "You've been jumpy all day." His scrutiny was unnerving, relentless. She felt like an insect pinned beneath a microscope. The confrontation she had dreaded, the moment he discovered her knowledge, felt terrifyingly close. She had to act, and soon. But the timing had to be perfect. One misstep, one moment of hesitation, and Lydia's fate would undoubtedly be hers. The air in the cabin grew thick with unspoken tension, the silence punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and Silas's heavy breathing. Ilara knew, with chilling certainty, that the fragile charade was about to end. The breaking point came with the dusk, a bruised purple sky bleeding into inky blackness beyond the small, grimy window. Ilara had been trying to subtly gather a few essentials, a small sack with the remainder of their dried beans, her precious mended quilt, Lydia's journal tucked securely inside her dress. She planned to wait until Silas was deeply asleep, then slip out into the night. It was a desperate, foolish plan, perhaps, but it was the only one she had. He was watching her, however, his eyes missing nothing. He'd been quiet for hours, a brooding, simmering silence that was far more menacing than any outburst. As she reached for the small tin of matches on the mantelpiece, intending to add them to her meager escape bundle, his voice cut through the silence, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "What are you doing?" She froze, her hand hovering over the matches. "Just getting ready for bed," she stammered, her back to him, her heart pounding a frantic tattoo against her ribs. "Liar," he snarled. She heard the scrape of his stool as he stood up. His footsteps, heavy and deliberate, approached her. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself. "Turn around." His voice was low, dangerous. Slowly, agonizingly, she turned to face him. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes glittering in the dim firelight. "You think I'm a fool," he hissed. "You think I haven't seen you?" Whispering to yourself, jumping at shadows, hiding things, he took another step closer, invading her space, his presence overwhelming. "What did you find, Ilara?" The way he said her name, soft, almost caressing, yet filled with an underlying menace, sent a shiver of pure terror down her spine. This was it. The moment of truth. She could deny, try to bluff her way out, but she knew it was useless. He knew. Or at least, he suspected enough. Her mind raced. Lydia's journal. If he found it on her, it would confirm everything. I don't know what you mean," she whispered, her voice trembling. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Don't you?" His gaze flickered down to the slight bulge at her waist where the journal was concealed. Before she could react, his hand shot out, grabbing the front of her dress, tearing the fabric. The journal tumbled to the floor, landing with a soft thud between them. Silence. A terrible, suffocating silence descended upon the cabin, broken only by the crackle of the fire and Ilara's ragged breathing. Silas stared at the journal, then slowly, deliberately, he bent down and picked it up. He didn't open it. He just held it, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on Ilara's face. "So," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "You've been reading things that don't concern you." Ilara's fear was a living thing, clawing at her throat, but with the exposure of her secret came a strange, reckless courage. The charade was over. There was nothing left to lose by speaking the truth. "Lydia," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "What happened to Lydia?" "And the others?" "The ones whose things are in that chest in the woodshed?" "The child's doll." Silas's face contorted, the calm mask cracking to reveal the raw ugliness beneath. "Curiosity killed the cat, Ilara," he spat, his voice venomous. "Should have kept your nose where it belonged." He took a step towards her, the journal still clutched in his hand. Lydia was weak. Like Elias. They couldn't handle this life. They didn't appreciate what I offered them. Ilara cried, her voice rising in disbelief and horror. "You offered them terror. You offered them death." He advanced on her, and she stumbled backwards, her hand instinctively going to the fireplace, searching for the iron poker. Her fingers closed around its cold, reassuring weight. "They got what they deserved," Silas growled, his eyes blazing with a fanatic light. "They tried to leave." "No one leaves me," he lunged. Ilara screamed, a raw, primal sound, and swung the poker with all her might. It connected with his outstretched arm, the one that had been injured by the bear, with a sickening thud. He roared in pain, stumbling back, his face contorted in agony. The journal fell from his grasp. For a moment, he clutched his injured arm, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and murderous rage. That moment was all Ilara needed. She didn't wait to see if he would recover. She turned and fled, wrenching open the cabin door and plunging out into the freezing, moonlit night. The icy air hit her like a physical blow, but she barely registered it. Behind her, she heard Silas's enraged howl, a sound that promised pursuit and retribution. She ran, blindly, desperately, into the unforgiving wilderness, the image of his hate-filled face burned into her mind. The fight for her life had begun. The forest at night was a terrifying labyrinth of shadows and unseen obstacles. Snow-laden branches clawed at her face and clothes, and the deep, powdery snow dragged at her feet, making every step an agonizing effort. Elara ran with the desperate energy of pure terror, Silas's enraged shouts echoing behind her, fueling her flight. The moon, a cold, silver disk in the inky sky, cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and reach for her, transforming familiar trees into grotesque, menacing figures. She had no sense of direction, only a primal instinct to put as much distance as possible between herself and the cabin, between herself and the monster she had left behind. Her lungs burned with the effort of drawing the frigid air, each breath a painful gasp. Her ill-suited city boots, already worn, offered little protection against the treacherous terrain. She stumbled frequently, falling hard into the snow, picking herself up with frantic haste, driven by the fear of Silas's pursuit. She could hear him crashing through the undergrowth behind her, his progress marked by snapping twigs and furious curses. He was injured, yes, but he was driven by a potent cocktail of rage and determination, and he knew this wilderness far better than she did. Lydia's journal, her only proof, her silent testament, lay back in the cabin. The thought was a fresh stab of despair, but there was no time for regret, no time for anything but survival. She had to rely on her wits, on her endurance, on any small advantage she could find. She remembered the dense thicket of young pines they had passed on their journey to the cabin, a place where the snow lay less deep, the passage more difficult. If she could reach it, she might be able to slow him down, perhaps even lose him. Veering off what she vaguely remembered as the path, she plunged into the deeper woods, the trees pressing in around her, their lower branches whipping at her face. The going was harder here, but she hoped it would be harder for him too, especially with his injured arm. Behind her, Silas's pursuit seemed to falter slightly, his curses growing more distant. Had she gained some ground? Or was he merely biding his time, using his superior knowledge of the terrain to cut her off? The thought spurred her on. The cold was a relentless enemy, seeping into her bones, numbing her extremities. Her hands, bare after losing her gloves in the frantic escape from the cabin, were stiff and aching. Her face felt like a frozen mask. But the fear, the adrenaline, kept her moving, pushing her beyond the limits of what she thought she could endure. After what felt like an eternity of desperate flight, she stumbled into the thicket of young pines. It was as she remembered, a dense, almost impenetrable tangle of branches and sharp needles. She forced her way through, the branches scratching her skin, tearing at her clothes, but she welcomed the obstruction. It would slow him down. She pushed deeper and deeper into the thicket, until she could no longer hear any sounds of pursuit. Panting, exhausted, she collapsed at the base of a large pine, hidden from view, the snow-laden branches forming a temporary, fragile sanctuary. She listened, her breath held, her ears straining for any sound, any sign of Silas. There was only the wind sighing through the treetops, and the frantic thumping of her own heart. Had she lost him? Or was he out there, circling, waiting? She knew she couldn't stay here for long. The cold was too intense. She had to keep moving, to find shelter, to find help. But where? In this vast, frozen wilderness, where was safety to be found? She remembered the direction of the rising sun from her first morning at the cabin. If she could keep heading roughly east, perhaps she would eventually strike a logging road, a trapper's line, some sign of civilization. It was a slim hope, but it was all she had. After a few precious minutes of rest, forcing herself to breathe slowly, deeply, to calm the frantic racing of her heart, she pushed herself back to her feet. Her legs were trembling, her body ached with a profound weariness, but her will, forged in the crucible of fear and desperation, remained unbroken. She emerged from the pine thicket cautiously, scanning the moonlit landscape. Nothing. No sign of Silas. Taking a deep breath, she set off again, moving as quickly as she dared, trying to choose a path that offered both concealment and a relatively clear passage. The moon, her only guide, began its slow descent towards the western horizon. Hours passed in a blur of exhausting effort, of fear, and fragile hope. She talked to herself, to Lydia, to the memory of her mother, drawing strength from their imagined presence, fighting back the despair that threatened to overwhelm her. Just as the first pale fingers of dawn began to touch the eastern sky, painting the snow-covered peaks with hues of pink and lavender, she saw it. Smoke. A thin, almost invisible plume curling upwards from beyond a distant ridge. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. Hope, so long suppressed, surged through her with an almost painful intensity. With renewed determination, she pushed herself towards the smoke, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. It was further than it looked. The terrain was difficult, cut by deep ravines and hidden creeks. Twice, she fell through thin ice into knee-deep, freezing water, the shock stealing her breath, her clothes instantly stiffening in the frigid air. But the sight of the smoke, growing steadily closer, drew her onward. Finally, an hour after sunrise, half frozen, limping, her clothes torn and encrusted with ice, she stumbled over the crest of the ridge and saw it, a small logging camp, nestled in a sheltered valley. Rough cabins, the smell of wood smoke and coffee, the sound of men's voices, the ring of axes. Civilization. Safety. Tears streamed down her face, freezing on her cheeks. She had made it. She was alive. She began to run, or rather, to stumble, down the slope towards the camp, waving her arms, shouting hoarsely, "Help! Please, help me!" The loggers, rough, burly men, stopped their work, staring in astonishment at the wild, disheveled figure emerging from the wilderness. One of them, a large man with a kind face and a thick beard, rushed towards her. "What happened? Are you all right?" Ilara could only sob, the words tumbling out incoherently, a torrent of fear and relief. "Him in the cabin? Silas, he tried to kill me." Lydia, the others, the logger gently guided her towards the largest cabin, the cook-house, from which the comforting aroma of frying bacon wafted. Warmth enveloped her as she stepped inside, a blessed relief from the biting cold. Other men gathered, their faces filled with concern and curiosity. She was given hot coffee, a thick blanket, a seat by the roaring stove. Slowly, haltingly, as warmth began to seep back into her frozen limbs, Ilara told her story. She spoke of the mail-order bride advertisement, of Elias Thorne, of Silas and his injury, of the desolate cabin, of Lydia's journal, the woodshed, the chest, the child's doll, and Silas's murderous rage. The loggers listened in stunned silence, their expressions hardening as her tale unfolded. When she had finished, the kind-faced logger, whose name was Jeb, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now. We'll take care of you. And we'll make sure that Monster pays for what he's done." True to their word, a party of armed loggers, led by Jeb and guided by Ilara's weary directions, set out for Silas's cabin later that morning. They found it empty, Silas gone. But Lydia's journal was there, lying on the floor where it had fallen. In the woodshed, they found the chest, its broken hasp confirming part of Ilara's story. The oilskin packages within contained more journals, more pathetic collections of women's belongings, and, horrifically, small, crudely carved wooden markers, each bearing a woman's name and a date. Lydia's name was among them. The child's doll remained a mystery, its owner unnamed, its story lost. Silas Thorne was never seen again. Some said he perished in the wilderness, a fitting end for a man who had thrived on its isolation to commit his atrocities. Others believed he simply vanished, moving on to find new hunting grounds, new victims. But in the area around Bear Creek, his reign of terror was over. Ilara remained at the logging camp for several weeks, slowly recovering from her ordeal. The loggers and their cook, a kindly woman named Martha, treated her with a rough, genuine compassion that began to heal the wounds to her spirit. Martha, especially, became a friend, a confidant, listening patiently as Ilara processed the trauma, the grief for Lydia and the other unknown women, the sheer, visceral terror of her escape. When she was strong enough, Jeb arranged for her passage back to the nearest town, providing her with warm clothes and a small sum of money collected by the camp. Leaving the wilderness behind was like emerging from a long, dark nightmare. The world seemed brighter, colors more vibrant, the sounds of civilization a comforting symphony. Elara never forgot Silas Thorne, or Lydia, or the terror of that isolated cabin. The scars, both physical and emotional, remained. But she was not broken. She had faced the darkest parts of human nature, had stared death in the face, and she had survived. She had found within herself a strength, a resilience she hadn't known she possessed. The desperate mail-order bride who had arrived in the wilderness seeking sanctuary was gone. In her place was a woman, forged in the crucible of fear and adversity, who knew her own worth, her own power. Her future was uncertain, but it was hers to make, free from the shadows of the past. She carried Lydia's story with her, a solemn vow to never forget, to honor the lives that had been so cruelly stolen. And as she stepped onto the train that would carry her towards a new, unknown horizon, Elara felt not fear, but a quiet, determined hope. She had walked through the valley of the shadow of death, and she had emerged, not unscathed, but undeniably, triumphantly, alive. The journey ahead would be her own, and she would face it with the courage of a survivor, her spirit, though tested, unbroken.